Some of the most expensive moving abroad mistakes happen before you ever leave. And if you're planning to move abroad with remote income or savings from the US, it's easy to spend months researching countries, visas, and the move itself. But after living abroad in multiple countries, I've realized a lot of the things that cause stress later aren't the move. They're the things you didn't know to prepare for beforehand. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through 3 things to do before moving abroad so you can avoid stressful or expensive mistakes after you've already left. Let's start with the very first thing you need to think through, because choosing the wrong country and visa can set the whole move up wrong from the beginning. This is what happened to me when I moved to Germany. I already had a remote job with a US company, so in my mind, the biggest question was answered. I could support myself, and I figured I'd move first and sort out the details once I got there. But once I arrived, I realized those details mattered pretty quickly. In Germany, you generally need to register in the tax system within the first few months. And as I started looking into that, I realized my income from a US employer didn't fit well into the German tax system. That created another issue with healthcare because access to public healthcare was tied to how I was registered and taxed. So it wasn't just one small detail I had overlooked. One part of the system affected the next. It made me realize that taxes and healthcare aren't side details. They're part of the basic structure your life has to fit into if you're going to live somewhere long term. And this is something I think many US remote workers underestimate before moving abroad. Having remote income or savings can make it feel like the biggest question is already answered, but you still have to understand how your income, healthcare, and tax situation will work in the country you're choosing. So before you commit to a country, this is one of the first things I try to understand. Start with healthcare. Don't just ask whether the country has public healthcare. Ask whether you would qualify for it based on your visa, your residency status, and the way your income is set up. If you don't qualify, then you need to know what kind of private insurance is available instead, and whether that changes the cost or practicality of living there. Then look at taxes. At what point would you become a tax resident? What would you be responsible for once that happens? You don't need to become an expert before you move, but you do need to understand whether there are any major red flags for your situation. Because if healthcare and taxes are going to make the country difficult to live in long term, that's something you want to know before you build your whole plan around moving there. So mistake number 1 is choosing a country before you understand how the basic foundations of your life would work there: your income, your healthcare, and your taxes. And even after you've looked at whether the country works for your setup, the second thing to think through is easy to underestimate from the US, because some of the biggest surprises are the things you didn't think to research. When I moved to France, I thought I had a clear enough idea of what life there was going to cost. I had looked at apartments and rent prices, and I felt comfortable with the numbers. But once I was living there, I realized I had only looked at part of the picture. One of the biggest surprises was heating. Gas can be expensive in France, and during the winter, I was paying around $500 a month just to keep my apartment warm. And I couldn't exactly choose not to heat it. It was winter, the apartment was cold, so that bill was part of living there whether I had expected it or not. I had assumed the smaller monthly expenses would stay small, but that experience made me realize I had spent too much time thinking about rent and not enough time thinking about the full cost of living in the country I was choosing. And I think this is where Americans often run into issues. You assume the costs you're used to in the US will translate abroad, but they don't always work the same way. So before moving, I try to understand the full monthly reality of living in that country, not just rent. Rent matters, of course, but I'd also look at the expenses that can change significantly from place to place. Utilities, healthcare, insurance, taxes, and anything that becomes a normal part of life once you're there. And I wouldn't rely only on averages, because costs can vary widely depending on your situation, and they change over time. I'd look for actual numbers from people living there now. Read expat forums, watch YouTube videos, and search for what people are paying month to month, especially people with a similar setup to yours. You don't need to predict every expense before you move, but you do need to look beyond the obvious costs. Mistake number 2 is doing surface level research and assuming you have the full financial picture. And once you have a clearer picture of the financial reality, the third thing to think through is the practical setup people often leave for later until it starts making the move more expensive than it needed to be. I learned this the hard way when I took my first 3-month trip to Europe and paid for everything with my normal US debit card. I didn't think much about it at the time. I just assumed a card was a card. But when I got home and looked through my bank statements, I realized I had been charged fees over and over again. Every time I used my card, there was a foreign transaction fee, and every time I took money out of an ATM, I was charged an ATM fee and a currency conversion fee. I had no idea those charges were happening, and after 3 months, they added up to a lot. That was the first time I noticed how expensive the wrong banking setup can be abroad. And after more than 10 years outside the US, I've learned there are a few accounts and tools worth getting in place early because they can save you a lot of money later. So before you leave the US, I'd make sure the accounts you rely on abroad are set up properly. About a month before your move, I'd start with your banking and cards because some accounts take time to open and you may need to wait for cards to arrive in the mail. I'd open an international friendly checking account. I personally use Charles Schwab because they reimburse ATM fees, don't charge foreign transaction fees, and make it easy to take out money abroad without getting hit by extra charges. I'd still keep your main US bank account too because it can make transfers, payments, and moving money between accounts easier. But I wouldn't rely on a normal US debit card as your main way of accessing money abroad. And if you use credit cards, check whether your current card charges foreign transaction fees. If it does, I'd get one that's better suited for travel before you leave. I'd also think through your US phone number before you go because banks, credit cards, and other US accounts often send verification codes to that number. One option is porting your number to Google Voice while you're still in the US, then using a local phone plan once you arrive. That can be much cheaper than keeping an expensive US plan or paying for international service long term. I'll leave links below to Google Voice number porting, Charles Schwab, and the travel credit card I look at so you can compare the options for yourself. So mistake number 3 is leaving your financial setup for later. Instead of making sure you can access your money, avoid unnecessary fees, and keep your US accounts working once you're abroad. And these are just a few examples of what US remote workers don't always know to think through before moving abroad. But there are so many more. That's why I created the Fearless Abroad Mentorship, a guided relocation process for US remote workers who already know they're moving abroad and want expert support figuring out the right steps in the right order. I'll leave it linked below.